So it is easier to know about Yahweh than it is to do what we know is pleasing to him. There are many, many people who know about God, but when we look at their lives, they're doing exactly opposite of what God's word says. And we can learn from Rehoboam and his son next week, Abijah. They know about God and they will talk about God, and for a time they will appear to walk with God. And today will look like, well, they cried out to God and God saved them. But if you looked at day in and day out of 17 years of Rehoboam's kingdom, for the first 5 years they walked with God, and the last 12, it was day in and day out that they only cried out to God when they were in trouble. And for the other time, if you looked at their kingdom, we'll see the analysis of the kingdom in 1 Kings 14 and down in verse 21. 1 Kings 14:21. Now Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. And this is just the summary of it. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem. So he reigned from the time he was 41 to 58. And the city, he reigned in Jerusalem, the city that the Lord Jehovah had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. And Ammonites were not known for their godliness, which likely wasn't a godly influence on him. Solomon should not have married his mother, but he did. And Judah did what was evil. So the kingdom of Judah is doing what's evil in the sight of Yahweh. And they provoked Yahweh to jealousy with their sins that they committed, more than all their fathers had done. So more than Saul, David, and Solomon. For they also built for themselves high places, and we've talked about high places before, and pillars. So next to the high place was a pillar, and that pillar was to represent Asherim, which we said was a female Canaanite deity and pornographic in nature, on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes in the land. And obviously Rehoboam knew about it, and he didn't do anything about it. And they did according to all the abominations of the nations that the Lord Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel. Okay, so there's a summary of the spiritual temperature of Rehoboam's kingdom. Now let's go over to Second Chronicles chapter 12, and we will look at this chapter. There's only how many verses here? 16. So we're going to look at knowing about Yahweh without seeking or loving or obeying him. This is so easy to do for us as believers, and if we aren't careful, we can allow our children to know about God without seeking and loving and obeying him. It is not enough to know about God and have the answers. That's where Rehoboam was. Proverbs, a lot of the book of Proverbs was written to Rehoboam and his brothers. And yet Rehoboam doesn't obey the wisdom that's in that book. And he's following after other gods, and he doesn't have the greatest example at the end of Solomon's life. Rehoboam Rehoboam is born a year before Solomon becomes king. And the godly rule, 24 years of godly rule that Solomon had, Rehoboam is 25 years old, at least, and he observes 25 years of blessing, of the temple being built, and knows better and knows all about God and the true worship of God. He knows Deuteronomy, that warns kings not to walk away from God. And yet, at the end of Solomon's reign, it seems to be the pattern that Rehoboam embraces instead of the blessing time that Solomon is reigning. So when Rehoboam takes over the kingdom, we remember that the kingdom is split. The godly people from the north, because of Jeroboam, all flee the northern kingdom of Israel and come, and they strengthen the kingdom of Judah. And look at verse 1 of 2 Chronicles 12. When the rule of Rehoboam was established and he was strong, and it says for 5 years, that he did not abandon the law of the Lord. But after 5 years, he was godly, obeyed God. He abandoned the law of Yahweh and all Israel with him. We're told in 1 Kings that all of Judah followed, abandoning the law of the Lord. And in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, and this is the only reason God allows this to happen, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem with 1,200 chariots, 60,000 horsemen, and people, foot soldiers, were without number, who came with him from Egypt, the Libyans, Sukkim, and the Ethiopians. So a lot of northern Africa. The Ethiopia is southern, the coast of the eastern coast of Africa. There is a massive army, people without number. We're going to see later that Asa, a grandson of Rehoboam, also encounters an Ethiopian army of 1 million men, and see how he fights differently here. But why is this army coming against Rehoboam? Is because they abandon the law of the Lord, and the other way that describe it in verse 2 is they had been unfaithful to Yahweh. And what happens whenever this huge army comes? He took the fortified cities of Judah. You remember that Solomon and Rehoboam, for a time, that they were faithful to the Lord. He is fortifying, which means he is building walls. He's watchmen, having all kinds of ways to protect those cities, and strong, and he's got a lot of wealth to do that with. And remember, he inherits a kingdom of gold. Silver was not even, it was so common, like gravel. Okay, that's how common silver was. Wow. Whenever Rehoboam becomes king. And 5 years after that is when this happens. Okay. And then Shemaiah, the prophet, came. Oh, so the Ethiopians and the Egyptians, Shishak king, the Pharaoh, comes all the way as far as Jerusalem. And Shemaiah, the prophet came to Rehoboam. So God's going to speak through this prophet to Rehoboam and to the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because they had nowhere else to flee. This is the last city to fall. And said to them, "Thus says Yahweh, you abandoned me, so I have abandoned you to Shishak, to the hand of Shishak." How simple is that? Like, you abandoned me, I'm going to abandon you. You've got this massive army to fight for you, but they have done no good. And your cities, all of your fortified cities have fallen, and now they're on your doorstep. They've come to Jerusalem. Then, verse 6, the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "The Lord is righteous. Yahweh is righteous." And when Yahweh saw that they humbled themselves, the word of Yahweh came to Shemaiah again through the prophet. So the second time God speaks in a very short amount of time here. And says God through Shemaiah the prophet to the leaders of Israel, or of Judah, "They've humbled themselves. I will not destroy them, but I will grant them some deliverance, and my wrath shall not be poured out on Jerusalem by the hand of Shishak." All right, so Yahweh communicates his analysis and his judgment very clear. And verse 5, "You abandon me, I will abandon you." Verse 6, the human response, "Yahweh is righteous. or we deserve this righteousness. This judgment is a righteous judgment of God. They agreed with Yahweh. So it sounds like, oh, they're godly now. They're not a godly king. He's not a godly king. We'll see the analysis later. But for now, he has a godly response. So then Yahweh responds. His first response is, because of their humility, I won't destroy them. That's verse 7. And then verse 8, response number 2. Nevertheless, they will be Egypt's servants, so that they can compare serving me versus serving Egypt. Notice verse 8. Nevertheless, they shall be servants to him. That word could also be translated slave, but it's a little broader than the New Testament word for slave. It only means slave. Here, it could mean they could be servants to him, so that they may know my service and compare my serving Yahweh versus serving the kingdoms of the countries. Okay, they didn't want to serve Yahweh. They abandoned him. God says, okay, you abandon me, I'm going to abandon you. You want to serve other gods? We'll see how they deliver you. They couldn't deliver them. And because they couldn't deliver them, God says, okay, you didn't want to serve me, I'm going to let you serve countries. And in serving them, you're going to see how good it was whenever you were serving me. Our country right now is abandoning God by the droves, thinking we are progressing, but this progression is away from God and away from liberty and freedom, and it is progressing right into the arms of sin, slavery to sin, immorality, gross immorality that is Pride Month that we're in the middle of, and it's disgusting, absolutely ugly, awful. And yet this is what happens whenever we abandon Yahweh and his order of creation, and we're left with the ugliness of sin. And we can't go along with it. We have to endure it. We have to reach out to those in the wake of this destructive sin, and those that have ruined their lives, and then they want to repent, and we need to welcome those to God who want to turn from their sin and back to God, and have serious consequences for their sin, and yet want to come back to God. Well, Israel isn't ready to turn back to God temporarily. They cry out to God, and God says, you're going to serve these countries, so you can compare the service and see how it goes. Verses 9 to 12. So Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. So this was all predicted, prophesied, and then it comes to pass right away. Verses 9 to 12. So Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the king of the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house. He takes everything gold that Solomon had. And remember, it was billions upon billions of dollars of gold. Every shield of the big shields were $480,000 worth of gold, and there were 200 of them. The small shields were half that value. It's like someone stealing a house, okay, today. And then the small shields, I think there were 300 of them that had, or 600 of them, half the value of that, and he takes all of those too. So all of this, and that was just the shields, let alone the treasures. And there were all around the temple, there were 3 stories of storage, let's say about the size of this room. Okay, and those rooms were filled with treasures that were going to supply the Israelites with worship. They were able to buy sacrifices. They were able to support all of the Levites and the priests and their service. And when the king of Egypt comes and just cleans them out. Wow. Billions upon billions of dollars of gold gone. So he lost all of the resources in those cities in Judah, and then he loses all of the wealth of Jerusalem all at once in this invasion. And he took away everything, it says in verse 9. The king's house lost all its treasures. The house of the Lord lost all its treasures. All of the shields were gone. He took away the shields of gold that Solomon had made. And King Rehoboam, he doesn't have gold to make shields again, made in their place shields of bronze, and committed them to the hands of the officers of the guard who kept the door of the king's house. And as often as the king went into the house of Yahweh, the guard came and carried them and brought them back to the guard room. It sounds like that Rehoboam says, I'm making shields of bronze, but I don't actually want to see them. So when I come to worship, can you just like get them out of my sight? That's almost what it sounds like here. Because he's embarrassed that under his watch, he lost all of the wealth of Jerusalem. And when he humbled himself, verse 12, the wrath of Yahweh turned from him so that not to make a complete destruction. Moreover, conditions were good in Judah. Okay, so at least economically, other than they lost all the gold, conditions were good in Judah under King Rehoboam. So God's judgment falls. Then the humbling judgment leads to the mercy of Yahweh, but it doesn't lead to them seeking God for his mercy and going back to worshiping God alone. They don't go after the root problem, which is what? They abandon Yahweh. They abandon the worship of Yahweh. They allow gross idolatry on every hill, under every tree. They've got pornographic images, male cult prostitutes all throughout Judah, and they don't go after that until we get to his grandson. Then they start cleansing and reforming. But until then, they are in the throes of wicked idolatry. But it's like a glimmer of hope here that they're not destroyed, but they don't actually go after the root problem. Verse 13. So King Rehoboam grew strong in Jerusalem and reigned, and Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 17 years in Jerusalem, the city that Yahweh had chosen out of all the tribes. It sounds like 1 Kings 14. And put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite, and he did evil. So God's analysis of these kings is either one of two things. They did what's right in God's sight, or they did what's evil in God's sight. When it comes to the end of your life and my life, that's the only analysis that's going to matter. Do we see that in the New Testament? Well done, or you wicked, slothful servant. That's the two choices. And God is not a God who cannot be pleased. Like he keeps moving the target. He tells us, you be like Jesus in the New Testament. You be conformed to the image of Christ. That is your life mission from Romans 8. And if you and I are conformed to the image of Christ, it's not perfect, but that's the direction our life is going. You can hear at the end of your life, well done, thou good and faithful servant. But if you abandon Yahweh and you abandon that mission and say, you know what, that's too hard. I don't really want, I'd rather be conformed to the image of something else. I'd rather conform other people into my image. And I want to give God worship on Sunday and Wednesday, and I want to live the rest of my Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, how I want to live. God is not the center of my life on the other 5 days. I'll give him a little token. I'll cry out to him like these guys did here. Whenever I'm in trouble, I'll cry out to God. But when it comes to day in and day out, I don't love God. I'm not serving him. He gets a little bit of worship, and I'll cry out to him when I'm in trouble, like Rehoboam. But my life, for the most part, is evil. That's sobering. It sounds like Rehoboam's godly because he cries out to God. He humbles himself, right? It's only because he's in trouble. But his reign, the majority of his reign is evil because he doesn't get rid of idols. He gives himself to idolatry on a day in and day out basis. And we can do the same thing. We can come on Sunday and give God praise. We can give him our money. We can worship him one morning a week and pray to him the other Wednesday morning or Wednesday night, and yet the rest of our lives be evil. And at the end of your life, we won't be surprised if you hear, you wicked, slothful servant. Or you can follow the Lord like 8 of the 20 kings are godly after David. and Solomon. When the kingdom is divided, there's 20 kings in the north and 20 kings in the south. All the northern kings are evil. Chronicles doesn't even record their reign. They're not important. What's important is, will the godly kings, will the kings of God's people, will they be godly or not? And we'll see this back and forth. Rehoboam's not one of the godly kings. He does evil. And how does God define evil in verse 14? He did not set his heart to seek Yahweh.
Yeah.
So, helping us, set your heart to seek God every single day. Your heart determines the direction of your life and every single choice that you make every single day. And if you're going to set your heart to seek something else whenever you're in trouble, oh, I'll cry out to God because these idols don't save me. Right. But how about, do you love God? Are you seeking God? Are you obeying his word every single day? Because if you're not, you're going to follow the path of Rehoboam and Abijah, his son, and Jeroboam, and the other wicked kings of Israel. But God gives us their life as an example. So I'm going to ask you, following God's definition here of what it is to be evil, would you be guilty of being evil today, or this week, or this year? The kingdom of Rehoboam could be summarized as going from gold to bronze. It's like he put all his money in the bag and the bag had holes, and he's just lost all the gold, all the wealth that was flowing into the kingdom. All of it flowed right out of the kingdom, right out of Rehoboam's hands. Why? Because he was unfaithful to Yahweh. He did not seek Yahweh. He sought other gods. Spiritual decline of Solomon led to spiritual and financial decline of his son. You do reap what you sow. God is not mocked. You sow to the flesh, you'll have the flesh reap corruption. This story is written for our learning, according to Romans 15:4, so that we, through patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope. So set your heart consistently to love and to seek Yahweh, and teach your children to do the same. Don't allow a little bit of idolatry.